truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, I want to talk about the Texas freeze, because we're about a year out from the anniversary of that very significant and unique cold event here in Texas, throughout much of the South, actually. I want to know what we've done to fix it since then, what caused it in the first place. Help us with that conversation. Timothy Fitzgerald is with us today. Tim, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I'll read a little bit about your bio. You're professor of business economics at the Rawls School of Business at Texas Tech. My brother went to Texas Tech. Served as the chief international economist at the Council of Economic Advisors under President Trump, as well as the senior economist covering energy and the environment. You were actually the chief international economist during the USMCA negotiations, representing the U.S. At the OECD in Paris as well. And you're quite the guy to talk to for this, I think. So maybe I'll just start with a really basic question. What happened during the Texas freeze? Let's refresh people's memories. And what were the fundamentals that led to that problem where we had blackouts in certain parts of the states?
So the second week of February last year, 2021, got really cold all across Texas. So unusually cold and an unusually broad geographic area that was affected by that cold weather. I mean, Texas is a big state, so it's entirely possible that it can be snowing in Amarillo and you're barbecuing in Houston. Mm-hmm. But this was an unusually cold and long and broad and wide storm, and people demanded a kind of an historic amount of electricity. A lot of that has to do with using electricity for heat, mm-hmm. but there have also been a lot of people moving to Texas. And so there was just more people, more customers, an historic demand level. And so all of that juice needed to be provided by the different components of the electric grid. And starting in the early morning of the 15th of February, which was a Monday, the generators couldn't keep up with the demand. And so to try to preserve the integrity of the grid, the system operator, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, they decided to quit serving some of the customers. This is what they call a load shed. They do it to try to protect the grid. They did it with the sort of idea that they would be able to rotate the blackouts around. Everybody might lose power for a couple hours, but then they'd get it back until the system kind of got back onto a more firm footing. And as that happened, they weren't able to roll the blackouts around, and there were customers around Texas who lost power for days at a time. In full disclosure, I will tell you the power never went out at my house. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a personal story here, but that was the sort of the size of it. It was a big historic storm, lots of demand, and the supply couldn't quite keep up.
And I guess, and that's what I mean by fundamental questions. I mean, what was wrong with our system that it couldn't keep up to that spike in demand? Was it an energy mix problem? Was it pipelines freezing, certain mechanisms on different plants freezing? What did we learn from that?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, there were a lot of contributing factors. There's no one culprit here. But we had thermal facilities. Okay, so both gas and coal facilities that tripped offline. There were gas facilities that were not able to get fuel to them. The facilities were ready to go. They were but they were not able to have fuel delivered to them by their vendors. We even had a unit on one of the nuclear units tripped off for a safety precaution. There was a sensor that went off, just sort of unusually cold, and there was a piece of pipe that nobody had really thought about, and it tripped a sensor, and the nuke unit kind of automatically shut down. So you also had renewable generators that weren't generating at the time. They weren't able to make up the difference. It was really cold, so lots of wind capacity installed in Texas. That was not able to plug the gap. It was overcast and cold and dark because it was winter, and so the solar generators weren't able to plug the whole gap. So there's no one failure to point out on the generation side. It was a kind of a situation in which you had cascading failures.
Yeah. And one thing I point out a lot is, it's not necessarily it's the wind turbines froze and weren't really producing the energy that we needed. We have a lot of wind power in Texas. That's not why necessarily the lights went out, but it is true. And you can disagree with me on this, but it is true that there's been an overinvestment in wind power and wind generation throughout Texas, throughout the country, but especially in Texas. And that means less money towards thermal generation, which is baseload power, which turns on when you need it. Now, in this case, not every time, but there's simple reasons for that, right? I mean, and they're fixable reasons. But in general, as a general rule of thumb, baseload energy turns on when you need it. Wind, you can't control that. Solar, you can't control that. And so you can invest as much wind as you want, but shouldn't there be like a minimum capacity for baseload energy to make sure that a grid does what is needed when demand skyrockets?
Well, so I'll kind of pick that apart a little bit. I think there's some kind of short run issues associated with kind of the immediate events around the storm a year ago, and then there's sort of longer term issues that we might want to think about what should an ideal electric grid look like. We have installed a lot of renewable generation capacity in Texas and across the country in the past few years, and that has changed the generation mix. Maybe not as much as you'd think. The big story in generation mix has been replacing coal with natural gas. And so that's really actually been on the kind of the thermal side of the house, on the thermal side of the generation mix. Now, do we have too much wind? I mean, we have times, in the spring and the fall in Texas when wind is generating a far larger share than anywhere else in the country. It could be generating a quarter of the power on the grid or even more than that. That, I think, is a testament to a couple of things. One, Texas is a great place to produce wind power. Two, Texas is a great place to sell wind power because of the way the grid is structured. So I think of those as opportunities. Those opportunities come with some costs that you've laid out. When we do get into a tight spot, bad winter storm, we're going to have a critical load. Can we be assured that we're going to be able to have reliable generation that is going to service people, and people aren't going to be freezing for 3 days with no power, and the pipes are freezing, they can't get water. I mean, it's a real sort of a cascading set of failures. So I think your question, is there a way we should guarantee a minimum amount of power? I tend to think that the market forces that are prominent in Texas can satisfy that, rather than having a kind of some other mechanism allocate prioritizing thermal production. But we do need to think about what the incentives are for all of the different players in the electric grid. That means consumers, and that means generators with different kinds of generation. The playing field may not be totally level. If you and I wanted to go build a nuke plant in Texas because we liked nuke, we thought it was a good source of baseload power, we'd have a heck of a time.
Right.
And if we wanted to go start a wind farm, I think we'd find a lot more favorable set of circumstances. And, so we can talk in the kind of over the longer run about, how we should think strategically about how to organize the generation on the grid. Yeah,
but I still think there's got to be a minimum. I mean, there's got to be an answer to that question, because it does seem like there's a point where there's too much, where the energy mix is weighted too heavily on unreliable energy sources, wind and solar. So, they did COP26 this year, the UN Climate Change Conference in Scotland. They're 100% wind. But of course, it doesn't work for them. The only reason they can do that is because they import energy from England when they need it. And if the UK in its entirety goes to 100% wind, then their answer is, well, we'll import it from another country, France. And so I just wonder why even bother going down this road when you know it doesn't work well, and when you know that there are energy sources, gas and nuclear, gas is definitely lower carbon than coal, pretty low overall, but nuclear is zero. So yeah, there's a cost to it. But as you noted, it'd be very difficult to build a nuclear plant in Texas or anywhere in the United States for that matter. A variety of reasons for that. But if this is about caring about two things, lowering carbon emissions and reliable energy, then you just have to invest in nuclear. I don't see any other way to do it. But instead of our monetary incentives are heavily weighted towards solar and wind. I mean, the reason it's so financially profitable to put wind in Texas is because, like you mentioned, our grid favors that electron coming from wind. So they always know they can sell it. See, a gas and nuclear plant, they don't get that. They don't get that benefit. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's a complicated formula that they use, but basically wind will get the benefit if it's producing energy. And of course they get subsidies from the federal government that nuclear can't even compete with. So it's, but let's assume the extreme where we eventually have 100% wind capacity. We haven't built a new nuclear plant or gas plant in a couple decades, and we haven't built very many. But our population is soaring. There's, what can we do to incentivize more investment in that baseload energy?
So one thing about the electric grid in Texas is it's what we refer to as a power only market. So I mentioned that I kind of like to think, like a lot of economists like to think, about the incentive that's provided by the market. And in Texas, the only way to get paid is to sell power. In other parts of the country, we actually have kind of layered markets on top of the power market for what we think of as electric capacity. Okay, so New York State is actually a pretty good example of this. They have a capacity market there. And basically that means that if you've got the ability to generate electricity that is extra, spare at the moment, you can enter into the capacity market and you can accept a payment to be ready to step onto the grid in case something happens. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm not sure that capacity markets by themselves are solution to all problems. They solve some problems and create others. I'd point out to you, just to kind of follow on the nuclear generation point. New York State's been losing their nuke plants even though they have capacity markets, which is creating problems for their electric grid there. So it's not a fix-all solution. Right. By any means. The one ray of optimism I'll shine on the nuke front is, there is we're making steps towards private nuclear reactor in Southwest Wyoming, compliments of Bill Gates. I think there are a lot of people who are really interested to see if that technology has opportunity. We certainly have a lot of know-how in the United States in how to make nuclear electric power work. I think the United States Navy is pretty good purveyor of that particular technology, and we could could think about how to bring that into play in the civilian grid as well.
So, back to root causes. I want to kind of go through a list of things that I think are myths that need to be debunked. So we'll do kind of a lightning round on this. Some people say this wouldn't have happened in a deregulated market, right? If Texas was connected to the national grid. So Texas is the only state that has its own grid. It's ERCOT. Mm-hmm. And the claim is that if we had just been connected to other grids, we would have been fine.
Okay, so it's lightning round. So I say false. No, so look, the nearby grids that we would have gotten power from, they were affected by the same storm. So the Southeast, as you said, off the open, they were having a lot of trouble. Southwest Power Pool, which is directly north, was badly affected as well. Even down into Mexico, if you'd had an interconnect across the international boundary, there was the
what would be a
hole
benefit?
was too big, and the interconnections couldn't have been big enough.
Yeah. What would be a benefit of connecting? Like, what is the best argument for connecting to the national grid?
I think the argument is that you may be able to save yourself money by not having built up enough capacity for the rare event, the 1 in 10-year winter storm that's going to drive demand through the roof. You don't have to have the assets built in your state, and you can just kind of import that electricity when you need it. That's the argument for it. There are also some more technical kind of system reliability kinds of things, but those are
it's not as if other parts of the grid don't go out on a pretty regular basis either. But what benefit actually do we have in Texas just because we have our own grid? Are there benefits to that?
Well, it's allowed Texas to be very innovative in terms of electricity policy over the last, I would say 20, 25 years, as Texas has been able to establish itself as a leader in wind deployment, in part because you didn't have to worry about interconnection issues.
Yeah. All right. Next claim. This wouldn't have happened if there was more diversity in our energy supply. So this is the opposite argument of what I'm making.
False, I think, is my answer there. As I say, this was a kind of a collection of cascading failures. We saw failures across different generation sources. There's not one finger that can be pointed at. We had coal go out, we had gas go out, we had nuke go out, we had wind that wasn't generating, we had solar that wasn't able to plug the gap. So I'm not sure that diversity for its own sake would have prevented the problem.
Mm-hmm. This wouldn't have happened if climate change wasn't happening.
Well, I think there are a group of people who every time there's an event, they want to try to link it to climate change. I think that's, motivated beyond scientific bounds. There is a whole field of attribution science that's emerged in the last 5 years. Look, 10 years ago, there was a similar storm in Texas in 2011. There was one in 2003. There was one in the 90s. These things happen in Texas. They are infrequent. And this one was particularly bad. The consequences were particularly bad. I think the relevant question is, do we want to have assets that we've invested in that are sitting around not really getting used so that we can use them one day every or 1 week every 10 years? That's the kind of way to think about that.
Yeah. Well, let's get into solutions. So maybe let's start with what has been done. What has the Texas legislature done to fix this problem? So if it freezes again next week, why are we better off than a year ago?
So I think they're really kind of 4, maybe 5 groups that have tried that have some responsibility that have taken action over the last year. I mean, it's not like anybody's been asleep at the switch. So start with ERCOT. They're in charge of kind of managing the electric grid. They're the clearinghouse for making sure that supply and demand meet and everybody gets paid. They've had some leadership changes, and one of the big initiatives that they've pushed is trying to make sure that facilities are winterized. So generation facilities are winterized. Here a few weeks ago, they put out their initial report, and like 99% of the facilities passed the winterization check. So that was, that's one dimension in which you're trying to make sure that you don't have generators that freeze up. Second group that was responsible is the Public Utilities Commission. So we have a whole new slate of public utility commissioners, and they're sort of managing the different local entities and the generators, and they have a lot of regulatory oversight. They're doing what they can to try to work with ERCOT and ensure that, in the event you had a similar storm next week, we wouldn't have the same outcome. I'm not sure that you can guarantee that won't happen, but kind of to keep going down the list, a lot of private generators, private firms there was a huge opportunity for these generation firms that they missed. The wholesale price of electricity was at the price ceiling. It was $9,000 megawatt hour, and there were these firms that wanted dearly to be able to generate and provide electricity, provide power to homes that didn't have power, and they weren't able to do so for various reasons. And I think that there's been a lot of private efforts to try to avoid the set of circumstances that firms found themselves in. You mentioned the legislature. I think the legislature and the governor have both tried to ensure that customers are not going to be A, stuck without power, and B, not be stuck with astronomical bills for power. They're not quite as much on the very front line of this. The last group that I would think about that deserves mention. So we did have, oil and gas wells that were freezing up, pipelines that were freezing up, and there were generators who were not able to generate, even though their equipment was ready. They were not able to generate because they were not able to get gas deliveries. That falls under the purview of the Texas Railroad Commission. They've probably done the least directly related to the aftermath of the storm. They've kind of said it was an electricity problem, and we did see a little cold snap over the weekend of New Year's this year, and we saw a dip in gas production in West Texas as we had wells freezing up. As some of that is sort of normal, but again, if you're going to have cascading failures, you'd want to try to think about all of them at once.
That's a good answer. So should we be pretty confident? Because these are all very specific fixes. Again, some of them happen without government's involvement. Some of them, I think, were like, one of the problems was ERCOT has a list of, do not black these people out, right? Because, like the production facilities, for instance, because then there's this cascade effect. Simply updating those lists seemed that it would have had a great effect as well. So another solution that I'd heard of, I wonder what your thoughts are on this. It was from Berkshire-Hathaway, and their proposal was to build 12 gas plants that were basically emergency use gas plants, and they would be designed that way in case of a situation like what happened. Is there any need for that? What do you think?
It sounds like a lot of money to spend for something that you're not going to use very often, right? I don't know exactly how big their proposal is, but you're talking about billions of dollars if you're building that many gas plants, and to not utilize that capacity. Maybe Uncle Warren Buffett has the money that he can spend it on, but for most of the rest of us, that would be a pretty large investment in something that isn't necessarily giving us a return.
No, but again, I still can't get past the problem that I feel we don't have enough of that baseload energy. And is the business of wind power, is the excessive amount of subsidies that are given to renewables a part of that? Because I feel like we don't have good answers to how we build more nuclear plants and gas plants.
Well, so gas plants are actually in a better spot than nuclear plants. Nuclear plant is sort of like a battleship. You want to kind of get it up and get it going, kind of straight ahead. You don't want to turn a lot, and you just plow through everything that's in your way. You provide great, reliable, clean baseload power. Natural gas has technologies that allow the gas to be very nimble, and it can come into the market and get out of the market depending on the market conditions. That's the comparative advantage of gas over coal is one reason why we've seen so much gas displace coal in the grid across the country. And so that's sort of happened naturally. If it's a question of what we think we want, do we need the ability to meet peak loads or critical loads when we have particularly high periods of electric demand, or are we looking for something to provide us a nice low, steady base load? Then nuclear looks a lot better. But the flip side to that argument, and I mean, just for the sake of the discussion, the great thing about those windmills, once the wind blows, you're generating power for next to nothing. And that's not even true. They're, on a marginal cost basis, those renewable technologies look better than even nuclear by quite a bit, or even combined cycle gas. So it's a trade-off between price and reliability.
Right?
That's true. That's absolutely true, and that's why there's been a huge opportunity for gas. There's a huge opportunity for gas to build. We know that wind, in West Texas, the wind blows early in the day and late in the day. And so you need to fill in the gaps around that, and that's an opportunity for gas generators. Down on the coast, on the Gulf, the wind blows in the afternoon a lot more, and you need to fill in around that. That creates an opportunity. There are other ways you can try to generate and fill that gap, but if you've got a steady load through the day, the question is, how do you want to meet it? Do you want to meet it with a slow, steady technology like a nuke plant, or do you want to meet it with a kind of a combination of more nimble and potentially less expensive technologies? I do think that if you got the small modular nuke reactors, that could be a real change in the dynamics of the electricity market, but that's still just over the horizon.
Yeah, and should production tax credits be more universal or technology neutral? I mean, can you explain the production tax credit on wind and how it's different from other energy tax credits?
Yeah. So if you and I go build a new wind facility and we get it qualified for the 2021 production tax credit, for the first 10 years it's operating, we're going to get paid as long as we're generating power. As long as our turbines are spinning, we're going to get paid. I think the current version of that, it's about $18 a megawatt hour. And what that production tax credit does, remember that Texas is a power-only market. There's a kind of a complicated onion of layers of people who are bidding into that market and making offers of how they're going to provide power, a day ahead. It allows wind producers to bid particularly low because they know that they're going to get that credit on top of whatever payment they will receive from selling power into the market conditions, depending on what those will be. So even if the price of power is negative, the grid is saying, don't give us any more power. We have too much power. We actually are going to charge you if you put more power onto the grid. It can be the case that a wind generator can use that production tax credit to actually have a positive cash flow. So that's where the distortion comes in. If we have a thermal plant and we're burning gas or coal, or even a nuke plant, we have some positive cost of operating at all times. That's kind of a simple explanation of how that production tax credit can distort the offering across different generation types.
What's going to happen to these wind turbines as they end their life cycle? This is a problem that a little unspoken of. I mean, I'm not anti-wind and solar, but I have a real problem with the notion that these are environmentally beneficial in a serious way, especially when you consider the mining necessary for them, the amount of construction needed. I mean, ironically, you cannot build wind turbines with power from wind turbines because you need heat. And so, I just wonder why we go down this track to such an exorbitant degree. With tax credits and favorable electricity markets that favor these unreliable sources of energy. And there's another problem. What do you do with them when they're done?
I appreciate that question. That's something that my colleague at Texas Tech, Mike Giberson, has been trying to get me interested in for a couple of years, and he finally managed to do it. So we did a little research project on what happens to these wind turbines and how they can get repowered. So like any other kind of asset, wind turbines depreciate. They're not as efficient or productive after they've been installed for a period of time than they were when they were first installed. And so there would be an optimal time to sort of replace and repair these turbines or just scrap them, which is kind of your question. But what ends up happening is at the same time the wind turbine technology is getting better and better, they're getting more efficient. And so what happens is these wind farms can actually, they call it repowering. And they basically take and put new blades on them, and they can put new gearboxes on them, new nacelles on them, and use the same footprint on the land, the same interconnection into the grid to generate more power. Mike and I went and took a look at that in Texas, and we were really interested in contrasting it to the experience in Europe, where they have a lot of wind turbines, as you said. Found some pretty different results. We find that there's not a lot of repowering going on in Texas yet, and where it is, it's been primarily targeted at trying to take advantage of some of these market incentives to help provide peak power in hot summer afternoons from coastal facilities. As part of the presentation that we give of that research, I have a picture of this old wind turbine up north of Amarillo that it may have been built by Neanderthals. I'm not sure exactly when it was built. Kind of looks like something from the backdrop of a Mad Max movie. What happens to these turbines if we can't use them and we can't repower them? I think we're going to have pretty sunsets through the pylons. There's not enough material there to make them very attractive to go scrap, and they might operate a little bit. I actually think what you'd probably have is you just have the wind turbine equivalent of stripper wells for oil and gas, where we have a lot of wells that are not very high productivity. There's a little bit of oil and gas left in the ground, and so when prices are good, we pump them. When prices aren't good, we don't. And I think that's probably what you're looking at in Texas with the investment in wind capital.
Let's talk about oil real quick. And the last thing I ask here is on oil economics. Back to some myth debunking. With gas prices so high and oil prices so high, and this has been proposed, the Democrats have talked about this, an oil export ban. Is that going to help gas prices? I guess their thought process is if we're not exporting it, then we have to use it here, and so we'll have more of it. I'm not sure. I think that's their argument.
Yeah, and the question then is what happens if you end up with a lower domestic price? What happens to the incentive for domestic producers to continue to bring that to market? Given how high oil prices are and have been recently, I'm actually a little bit surprised we don't see more rigs out in the field drilling new wells. So there's something else going on than just the price incentive, and maybe it's a fear of different regulatory environment or another regulatory shoe about to drop.
Yeah. Well, a federal judge, I read this in the article Friday, I think. A federal judge had just yanked a lease sale on federal lands for offshore drilling too. So that, and they'll use climate change as the legal reasoning, which I think is BS legal reasoning, but it's what they're doing. I mean, this kind of wokeism has infiltrated our spheres of production pretty handedly.
Yeah, look, the opening up the U.S. domestic production to global markets in 2015 was a great policy reversal. It reversed sort of 40 years of export ban that we'd had, and I think it was a win for U.S. producers. Remember that U.S. production, about 75% of it comes from private land, private minerals. The United States is different from other countries in the world that we have. Dan Crenshaw can own minerals in Texas and benefit from that extraction. It doesn't just go to the government agency, the government oil ministry, the way it does in most other countries. And so it's a much more democratic and broad-based positive economic shock. I did some work on that a few years ago, but by promoting U.S. production, we help not only the producers, but also mineral owners, and there are millions and millions of mineral owners around the country. There were predictions at the time when the oil import ban was lifted that it was going to lead to skyrocketing U.S. prices, and it hasn't. It's led to price convergence between the U.S. benchmark and the global benchmark. There's been no sky falling after the reversal of the export ban.
Yeah. Also, our refineries don't refine the kind of oil that we drill for in Texas and throughout the U.S. So that's another thing people don't understand. We import oil so that we refine it and we export it because it's a global commodity also. So it doesn't seem to me true that there's a domestic price. I guess if you're not allowed to trade with anybody and do anything, then I suppose it ends up that way. But it's such a highly simplistic way of looking at it. What policies could we put in place right now that would encourage that production?
Well, I think there have been some signals of changing a regulatory regime, and there's a little bit of regulatory uncertainty, policy uncertainty that, again, if you and I are sitting in the boardroom of an oil company and we're trying to decide whether or not to go deploy, millions or maybe even billions of dollars in the field, we want to be pretty sure that the rules of the game aren't going to change until we can get a return on that investment. That's a difficult needle to thread, given kind of increasing political awareness about climate change, and maybe not political resolve or direction on how exactly to deal with that. Should we sort of mandate what our fuels and power sector should look like, or should we try to create market incentives, or should we do something else, or should we do nothing? I don't think that's clear, and so that uncertainty about where the policies are going to come down, I think, has a dampening effect on investment, and that's a pretty big factor. I mean, there's a secondary factor if you look at the performance of, particularly in the shale oil sector. They've had a lot of money from Wall Street for a long time, and they haven't returned as much of it to Wall Street as Wall Street would like. And so, Wall Street's kind of looking around to say, well, those guys didn't necessarily give us as much money back as we thought. Maybe we should give money to somebody else. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a systemic problem. I think that's more specific to individual companies. Yeah. And we've got no shortage of people who know how to drill oil wells. It's just a matter of kind of reorganizing the industry to where the capital channels get freshened up.
Yeah. Well, Tim, that's all I got for you. I appreciate it. That's hopefully Texans sleep a little bit better at night, knowing that there's at least a lot of fixes to what happened last year. There was a lot of simple fixes that I think we can be happy about, and it's good. It gives us a lot of food for thought on the future, the energy mix in Texas and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you.